Hey guys, so today I'm going to be wrapping up all the books I read in September. Overall, September was a pretty successful reading month for me. I didn't complete all the books on my TBR. I am at the moment halfway through The Black Prison and I have made a start of The Eye of the World, so I will be completing them in October. Let's start though with the book I just want to get out of the way. That is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. So if you've been following my channel, you would know that this book has been on all my TBRs since June. I did start it in June. I did put it down and then restart it, but basically I've been buddy reading this book with Ishi from Ishi Time since June, and it should have been a sign to both of us that it was taking this long, that we weren't enjoying it. But I just think we both wanted to love this book so bad that we kept telling ourselves that once we got into the story, because it was pretty dense to start with and kind of dense the entire time, but we told ourselves that there was going to get to a point where we would just talk. There was promising things in the beginning, which I think also led us to want to continue, but we hated this book. We actually both in fact gave this book 1 star. Yeah, so we start off in early 1800s in England. We follow this society of magicians. However, none of these magicians are really technically magicians. All they are these old men who sit around all day reading books about magic, but they don't actually do any magic. And then one day they find out that there is a magician called Mr. Norrell who can actually do magic. They then get into contact with Mr. Norrell and meet him. Other people in London, the government and ministers and the military find out about Mr. Norrell being able to do practical magic, and they decide to bring him into London and sort of use him. So he kind of helps out the government and the military. The backdrop of this is the Napoleon Wars, so Mr. Norrell's magic does help aid the English with the war, but we never really get a lot of that. That's hardly part of the story. Then we meet Jonathan Strange, who is another magician who has taught himself magic but wants to learn more magic, and he ends up becoming a pupil of Mr. Norrell. But this doesn't really work out. Mr. Norrell doesn't want anyone else to learn magic, and he sort of takes Jonathan Strange on so that he can make sure Jonathan Strange can never pass him in becoming a better magician. And this book is kind of a competition between the two about who's the better magician, but it's not a competition in the sense that there's any stakes or any fighting or battle between the two. It's just, I guess, these two trying to prove themselves better than one another, but in the most mediocre, boring way possible. This book was just nothing. It's very rare that I finish a book and go,
what the freaking hell was the point of that?
But that's what I said to myself when I finished this book. I just didn't understand the point, and there was so much of nothing that went on. There were some really intriguing elements at the very beginning of this book, around page 80. Mr. Norrell, to prove he is a magician and can do practical magic, and something that makes him really well known as a magician in England, is he brings this lady back from the dead. And I was so intrigued by that, and I thought we were going to follow more of that lady and the repercussions of her being brought back to life, because to bring her back from the dead, Mr. Norrell did have to make a deal with the devil. And I was expecting that to be a much larger part of the story for longer, because it is a part of the story and it is a pretty significant part, but it was just hardly in the story. And then that lady, her name was Lady Pole, who was brought back, hardly had any other relevance to the story, and she only ever popped up in the story when she was needed to further the plot. In fact, all the female characters were written that way, and I just hated it, especially since I was reading so many misogynistic books in September to make my misogynistic discussion video. I did not expect this book to also be misogynistic, because it's by a female author, but you never know. It was so disappointing. I'm so frustrated. It was so boring. I did like the writing, but the story was so boring. I didn't like any of the characters. The most intriguing parts of the story, like I was saying, Lady Pole, and they brought up fairies and the Raven King. There were all these interesting elements that were hardly part of the story, unfortunately, and those were my favorite parts. I just hated Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. They were both these petty, arrogant men who wanted to be the best at what they did, especially Mr. Norrell. He was the worst. I just did not like him at all. This might possibly be my most disappointing read of the year, which is so sad, but here we are. This month I also listened to an audiobook called Lion. This is a non-fiction book. The author tells his story, how he was a child in India and he got separated from his family. He accidentally one night gets on this train and gets taken away from his family village into one of the main cities in India, and for a few days he's living off the street. He's then taken into an orphanage and then eventually adopted by an Australian couple and then moves out to Tasmania, Australia and is raised there. We follow him as he grows up and he tries to start tracing his way back home by following the railway lines in India and using Google Maps to look at the places to recognize where he used to live and grew up when he was 5 years old. He tries to recognize it by sight. I really enjoyed this book. It's one of those non-fiction books that does read like fiction because of the story element, and I really just enjoyed listening to the story. I liked learning more about adoption in Australia. That's something I want to look more into because I know it's really hard to adopt here, and I'm pretty sure international adoptions aren't very common. This book does touch on homelessness of children in India. It touches on poverty in India, touches on family and belonging. I also watched the movie and I enjoyed that too. I highly recommend this. I think this is a great tool if you're someone who wants to get into non-fiction but you're hesitant. I think this is a really great starting point. So yeah, I don't rate non-fiction, so I didn't give this book a rating, but I really enjoyed it. I also finished Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson. This is the second book in the Stormlight Archive series. I really loved this book. This book follows Shalyn, who in the first book we do meet her and she's a young adult and she's just ventured away from home because her family is kind of in times of need, on the brink of ruin sort of situation, and she leaves home to try and save her family by disguising herself as someone who wants to become an apprentice to this lady called Jasna, who is the sister to the king, who is very well educated and a scholar of sorts. Shalyn pretends to want to become a pupil and be an apprentice under her, but really what she wants to do is steal this magical object that Jasna has in her possession and use that magical item to save her family. And what I really loved about this book was Shalyn's POV was the main POV, so we still had POVs from the other characters, but she was the central character. We got to see her flashbacks, which was so interesting to see who she was prior to when we first met her and what her past was actually like and how that contributes to who she is now. I really liked how this book also went more in depth with the magic and the history of the magic. We have a lot more context to how the magic works. I also really liked that in this book we had all the characters meet. So in book one, all the characters were really on their own storyline and we're really being introduced to them and their situations. Whereas in here we have them all meet and interact, which is just so fun. I'm obsessed with the dynamic between Kaladin, Adolin, and Shalyn. Like, they're such an OTP3. Like, if they're not all together, which I don't think they're going to be by the end of the series, I really want them to be. I think my favorite thing about this book as well was all the development. We got to understand the spread more, we got to understand the direction of the story more. We also got a peek into their enemy. So in book one, you're kind of introduced to the setup of these people fighting against these other species, and in here we actually got some points of views of characters of that species and kind of see where their intentions are and what things are like on their side of the story, which I thought was so fascinating, and I can't wait to continue on and to find out what happens next. I am actually currently reading Oathbringer and I'm not loving it as much because Dalinar unfortunately is the main character in Oathbringer and he's my least favorite character, but I'm getting through it and I gave this book 5 stars. I also listened to the audiobook of Flashback by Shadow Messenger. This is book 7 or book 8. I've lost count to where I'm up to in the Keeper of the Lost Cities series. I have been reading this series since March and I've had a mixed experience with this series. Some books I've absolutely loved and some books I haven't really gelled with, and unfortunately this one is my least favorite so far. My biggest issue with this book in particular is it just felt like a filler book, and I think it was book 2 that I also felt this way about, where it just doesn't feel like what was happening in the story and the plot wasn't contributing to the overall story that the whole series is kind of in the direction of heading. This just very much felt like a novella of sorts, even though it's not a novella, it is an actual installment in the series. I'm still going to be continuing on, even though I didn't love this installment. I found it to be quite comforting and something that I would pick up when I was feeling slumpy. I gave it 2 stars. I also picked up The Bloomer is Dead. This book is like a horror, thriller, survival story. We follow this girl who's taken on this cave diving job and she's claimed to be a lot more experienced than she is, although she is experienced. Like, she's not a complete noob, she's just not as experienced as she claims to be. She gets this cave diving job and things kind of go a bit haywire quite quickly and she gets stuck in these caves. But what gets really trippy is the person that she is working under and the person that she is communicating through via communication, the person she's working under and she can communicate with under in the caves is also lying about their intentions. So there's a lot of like mystery behind the characters' intentions. My favorite thing about this book was definitely the atmosphere. It felt really dark and damp and isolated and confined in these caves, and it felt really, really terrifying being down there alone. And it was also really scary, this main character having to rely on this person on the other side who she's talking through with like a, I don't know, walkie-talkie or something, and that person not being a reliable source and that person lying and not being trustworthy made it really, really scary. The characters kept flip-flopping between being trustworthy and untrustworthy, which at times made the book really, really intense, but at other times made it really, really frustrating and a little bit repetitive. I was also surprised by how science fiction-y this book was. I was not expecting it to have so many sci-fi elements as it did. It's definitely on the softer side of sci-fi, not hard sci-fi, but I was still surprised to see that in there. I actually kind of wish though that the book took those sci-fi and speculative fiction elements and did more with them, because those were the bits that I was definitely most intrigued by. The last thing I would say was there was a relationship in this, and I feel weird saying I don't like it, but I just don't think I like relationships in thrillers because there's not a whole lot of time to develop a relationship. I'm definitely someone who likes a slow burn relationship. I like time to be given to the characters to really develop feelings for one another and for us to see that play out and to watch their dynamic. Whereas because this book is so short and there's so much focused on the thriller element, I just kind of felt like the romance was thrown in there. I ended up giving this one 3.75 stars because it was a really quick read and it definitely did what it intended. Like, I was scared, I was intensely reading, so yeah, at the end of the day I really enjoyed it. I also listened to another middle grade book, and this one was called The Dragon Warrior. This was so fun, and I picked this one up at the perfect time because I just needed something fun and wholesome, and this book delivered, and I'm so happy. This book follows this young girl and she really struggles to fit in this really Chinese society where she lives, and her brother does as well. And in this society there's all these warriors or people who want to be warriors. So one day she accidentally kills this demon and finds out that she is, or possibly could be, the Heavenbreaker, which is this legendary warrior that will serve the gods. She then goes on a quest with her brother and some friends over all the different Chinatowns and tries to defeat demons. Like, it was just so fun and wholesome. I loved the gang dynamic. Like, that was my favorite part. There was a couple of characters I wasn't expecting to be part of the gang dynamic when we were first introduced to them, and they were, but I really liked that they were because I think they really contributed a lot to the group dynamic. There were so many like funny jokes. Like, there was all these jokes that, like, oh my god, that smells like fake Gucci. It talked about the main character, how she's a girl and she shouldn't want to be a warrior, how she shouldn't be, and then her brother, her younger brother, he should be the one who was more skilled at fighting and skills required of a warrior, but he wasn't the warrior type at all. He's more book smart. It also talked about Chinese beauty standards and how she was so far from Chinese beauty standards because she is biracial and she also has tan skin, and I really liked how it touched on so many things, and I really liked the way it did it as well. However, having said that book was wholesome, I was not expecting the ending. Oh my goodness, the ending almost broke me. Like, I'm like, this is such a wholesome story, this is exactly what I need, I'm so happy now. And then the ending happened, and wow, I'm still surviving, getting over it. The next book does come out in October, thank goodness, so I will be picking it up. I'm very, very excited for it, and if you're looking for a new fun middle grade, I highly recommend this. Okay, let's quickly talk about Jade War, another one of my favorite reads of the month. This book is the sequel to Jade City. This series is called The Greenbone Saga. The Greenbone Saga follows this mafia family, and it's set in this urban Asian fantasy setting. We follow this family and how they work with the other gangs and try to keep power within their gang, and also how they work with Jade, because in this world those who possess Jade possess all sorts of magical abilities. It's a very character, political, family-driven novel. I feel like what this book does really well, and what I particularly love about this series, is how intricate the details are with all politics and all the dynamics. So it looks a lot at like culture and hierarchy, and the hierarchy amongst the gang members and how they're family and how that affects their relationship dynamic. And then it also looks at the politics between like the family members and then the other gangs. And also this book in particular, we see a character travel overseas, whereas in the first book we're focused on the one city. Because a character in this book travels to another part of the world, we get to see how the other parts of the world use Jade or don't use Jade, and how their gang and politics work. And it was just so fascinating and so intricate, and like the use of Jade is so intricate. In the first book we see like some of the younger characters go to school, so they have to go to school to train to use Jade, because it's a really powerful powerful magical device and it's not for everyone to use, and some who try to use it and use it incorrectly can go mad. It's just so fascinating, and these characters are just as intricate and complicated. There's one character, my favorite character in book one, and this book just made me have such mixed opinions on this character because this character is so unpredictable and so like misogynistic and questionable, but in the most realistic sense. And like there are points in the story where Fonda Lee writes this character in a way that makes me want to love them, but then that character does things that makes me want to strangle them, and it's a journey of emotions reading this book. And I did buddy read this with Rue. Well, not really, I kind of ditched out buddy read and read this in like one night. Sorry Rue, I couldn't help myself. I'm obsessed with what Fonda Lee does. I so often feel so like I've been robbed in books of certain developments, of politics, of storylines, of characters, and just the attention to detail that Fonda Lee goes into with all those things. It just amazes me, and I love how complex it is, and I just love how thought-provoking it is and how much depth it is. It's just truly incredible. I highly recommend this series if you haven't picked it up already. I will also say Fonda Lee does this thing really well with pacing where you can feel how the stories kind of calm down and you know something's going to come, and bang, it does. I will say it is kind of a bit funny how much time passes in this book. I think this book goes over 3 or 4 years, and there were times it didn't feel like that, and I don't know how I feel about that. I was talking about it with friends. Some of them did not like it at all, and some of them said that they really liked it because it gave time for political issues to brew. Overall, it didn't bother me too much, and I still really loved it. And I gave this book, look, I think it's a 4.75 stars, but I gave it 5 stars on Goodreads. I don't know, I loved it. That's all you need to know. The next book I want to talk about is The White Book. This book I was originally going to use for a vlog that I ended up scrapping. This book is translated from Korean, and it's a really short book. The audiobook was only 100. The audiobook was only 1 hour and 20 minutes long, and it reads more like a poetry collection than a actual short story. It's kind of this letter, very beautifully told letter, that the author's writing to a sibling that their mother lost when the sibling was a baby. It touches on all things white, so it talks about snow, it talks about blank white paper, white sheets, white shirts, and it just does it in this like really poetic way. It uses a lot of metaphors to talk about sadness and to express grief. It was just so stunning, and I don't really know how much else I can say to you about it other than it's very, very short and was beautifully written. So if you're someone who's really into really beautifully vivid writing that can really paint a picture and emotions, I highly recommend this. But there wasn't any really like structure in terms of plot or story or character, which is so interesting because I still found the writing in itself to be quite moving because of how beautiful and vivid it is. There's this beautiful quote I wrote down: "Each moment is a leap forward from the brink of an invisible cliff, whereas time's keen edges are constantly renewed. We lift our foot from the solid ground of all our life lived thus far and take that perilous step into the empty air, not because we can claim any particular courage, because there is no other way." I just think it's so beautiful. Yeah, if you're looking for a short book to bump up that Goodreads TBR before the end of the year, I recommend this. Okay, let's very quickly talk about Stormfront. If you follow me on Twitter, you would know I despise this book. I gave it 1 star. I did an entire thread of my thoughts, and I used quotes from the book to explain why I didn't like this and why I found this to be problematic because of how misogynistic it is. This book is the first book in the Dresden Files series, which is a 16-book long series where we follow this wizard detective Harry Dresden in this urban fantasy Chicago. That's kind of it. Like, this one book alone is just about this isolated case. Well, I don't know, but I don't think this case that was in this book is going to follow on in the next couple of books. But I just hated this main character. I hated how misogynistic he was. I've had someone say to me that this book isn't misogynistic, that the main character is just sexist, and I've also had that same person say to me, and I've seen other people say this around, that Jim Butcher chose to make this character sexist in order to use it as a character flaw to later develop that character. And I honestly don't think Jim Butcher did that. I don't know if he said that first or if fans have said that in order to kind of cover their asses because of how bad the sexism or misogyny, whatever you want to call it, is in this, but I don't think that's the case. I'm going to leave my thread link down below so you can see exactly what I took issue with this. yes, there's a lot of points I made. My biggest issue with this is, especially with that argument that this character is sexist and it's used as a character flaw, is I haven't read any of the other books, obviously, and I'm not going to. I've only read this book. But this character, Harry, he's painted in a light where he's a hero so often. The women all come to him for help, and every single other male character in this book is either a villain or is fat, old, and balding. The way the description's done and the way Harry is described against the other male characters, he's seen as this knight in shining armor, this hero, and then all the other men are villains or ones that you don't want to bother with. It's really problematic when this hero is a misogynist. He's supposed to be the hero. He's supposed to be the one you admire and you look up to, but that's misogynistic trait is supposed to be a character flaw, which I just see no argument with that. I just don't get how people excuse this book. If you love it, you love it, and that's fine. I'm not telling you not to love the book, but you can still be critical of it. I don't really want to say anything else about this or spend any more time on it. I'm going to be talking about this in my misogyny video, and I'm going to touch on how Harry Dresden is written in this way where he is a hero, but then at the same time he's a misogynist, and then how problematic that is in itself, because I don't think that is a discussion that comes up enough around this book. It's an issue. It's really an issue. I just realized I completely forgot to mention that I also read Edge Dancer, which is the small novella that is the book that takes place after Words of Radiance and in between Oathbringer. I didn't love this. Didn't really hate it either. I gave it 3 stars in the end. We follow a character that we meet in Words of Radiance, and she's a child, and just the language used was so frustrating because she just kept using the word awesome to describe, well, herself mostly, but other things as well. And it was so frustrating and also funny because I filmed a video right after finishing Edge Dancer and I kept saying awesome in that video, and I got so frustrated with myself while editing because Lift and Brandon Sanderson just really rubbed off on me and made me say awesome way too many times. Can't really say anything else about the book because it's book 2.5 in a series. I also read Prince of Thorns by Mark Lawrence. This is my second Mark Lawrence book, and even though he is kind of problematic in not just himself as an author but also in his content, I just don't think his books work for me. I really struggle to connect with them. I had the same issue with Red Sister. I think his narrative style and how he does this 2 timeline narrative, which usually would work for me, the way he does it does not, and I really struggle to understand his characters and their intentions. Like, I feel like you don't always have to understand characters, but for me to understand the story, or to feel, not even just understand the story, but to have motivation to read the story and to continue, I need to kind of understand the characters' goals and intentions. At least have like a pretty good sense. Like, I don't need to have a full picture. For a good chunk of this book, I didn't know what the main character Jog was up to, and that really bothered me. This story follows this boy called Jog who is a prince, and when he was, I want to say about 10 years old, he witnessed the death of his mother and brother. He's then found by a bunch of mercenaries. I want to say the mercenaries take him in because they're older, but that's kind of incorrect. It's kind of like Jog takes them in, and they end up traveling on the road, and it's his sort of quest and journey to take back the throne that his father has, but he eventually wants to expand on that and take over like a good proportion of the world, which I think is what's going to happen in the next couple of books. My issue is, first of all, I just didn't find it believable that these mercenaries who weren't good people find this princeling and just follow him and do what he wants and do his bidding and his goals. Like, why? I just didn't understand what was in it for them. Jog's this like 11, 12-year-old boy who's just a brat. Why would grown men just want to follow him around? It just didn't make sense to me. Also, again, Jog's character didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. We are told from the very beginning that he is evil. Going into this, his character had been described to me as basically Prince Joffrey, but this guy just didn't have, I don't know, any reason to be like Prince Joffrey. Like, Prince Joffrey obviously is the way he is because he's just a spoiled brat who gets whatever he wants, but this guy wasn't like that. He kind of lost a lot of his privilege earlier than Joffrey, and I just didn't understand why why he was so evil. And again, the whole intentions and goals things, I just didn't have a full grasp of what was going on in his head, and it made me feel a huge disconnection to him as a character and to the story overall. I also am really sick and tired of Mark Lawrence's fat phobia. I found Red's sister to be quite fat phobic, and again in here I found him to be fat phobic. I did actually read this book for my misogyny discussion video. It's definitely like a male orientated or male dominated story. There's very few female characters and they don't have a whole lot of relevance, but I mean, it wasn't as bad as Stormfront, which was constantly objectifying women. This book was okay. I gave it like 1.75 stars. I don't know if that's too generous, but we're going to leave it there. I'm so conflicted because I own the next 2 books in the series in hardback. I have such regrets about buying the whole series in hardback before reading this book, because I don't know if I should read them. Like, I kind of want to just because I spent my money, but I know I'm not going to enjoy them, so what do I do? I'm an idiot. Okay, the last book I want to quickly talk about is a short story thing I listened to, which is called The Ballad of Black Tom. This book is set in the 1920s. It follows this young black man. We start off and we're following him. He's struggling to get by. It's just him and his father. He's struggling to support him. He also wants to be a magician, but he's struggling with that. And he ends up getting mixed up in magic, and the story ends up being about the consequences of that and the consequences of magic. I love stories where they talk about consequences of magic or people getting involved with magic. I think it's so interesting. I wish though with this book that the fantasy elements were more heavy or more involved in the story, because they were so fascinating. Something else that was really interesting about reading this book was how it looked at police violence and prejudice against black men, and it was so interesting reading that set in 1920s when we still see that on the news today. I liked that inclusion, as sad as it was, because something's really changed and it's been 100 years. I liked that we got to see it in a historical context. I thought that just added to the story. This book just had a real sinister, atmospheric tone to the story, which I thought was so interesting. And also, this is a retelling of one of Lovecraft's books. I can't remember which one. I haven't read any Lovecraft, but it is a retelling. The only thing is it's just too short. I really struggle with short stories. Like, even now I'm struggling to know what to say to you because it's so short. Like, what can I say that doesn't spoil it? But also, I just wanted more. Like, there was definitely just so many elements I was fascinated by that I just wanted it to delve into more. But I ended up giving this book 4 stars. Still really enjoyed it. Going to read more from this author soon. Okay, so those are all the books I completed in September. Thank you so much for watching. Please let me know if you've read any of these or if you're planning to pick them up soon. Tell me how your reading went in September. I would love to know, and I hope that you're enjoying whatever you're currently reading, and I hope to see you soon. Bye!